So as Joel mentioned, I'm going to introduce CognitiveScale and kind of our product and how we're applying that product to help solve for things around AI personalization. I don't know if we invented personalization, but we definitely have had a lot of time productionizing some very cool use cases across different industries. So what I thought was we can have some time in PowerPoint and help set up the context. But my role at CognitiveScale is really leading all solution architecture and consulting. So that's everything from sales engineering to client engineering. So I'd like to also show you guys some of the capabilities within the product itself and see what you guys think, right? Okay, so just a brief overview of CognitiveScale. So we're located in Austin, Texas. That's actually where I'm from. And as Joel mentioned, I just want to thank you guys all for hosting us. It's great to be out here in an in-person event. And always happy to come to San Francisco. So if there's more of these, I hope that I'll be able to come back if I don't butcher this presentation, right? As we mentioned, we're founded by senior executives from IBM Watson. So this was really the first group that productionized or commercialized the Watson QA system that was coming out of Jeopardy. And that's how I got my start, really. And I was talking to Alexi earlier, what brought you to CognitiveScale? And it was the people. Right? It was the individuals that really started the Watson Labs and really looked at ways of how they could take something from spawned out of research and apply that to a commercialized product, and that's what really spawned this startup in Austin. As a small go-to-market, we do focus primarily in a couple of different industries. So primarily that's in healthcare as well as financial services. But even though that I would say our breadth of clients isn't overly large, the clients that we do have a very large member population. So we do service actually over 100 million individuals here in the country, whether that's coming from large banks to large healthcare companies. Now, what we do is we're not, I would say, a data science platform, right? We're not here to author new machine learning models. There's a lot of different technologies and products out there today that are doing that. But the space that we really help fill is how do you take an insight that's being produced out of some model, and how are you bringing that into an application at a system level? And this is something that's come up with the Forresters and the Gartners really in the past 12 to 16 months, where they're looking at this discipline around AI engineering, or Forrester's calling it an AI maker platform, which is really understanding that there's many different personas out there that need to come together when it looks to being able to build out an end-to-end application. So you have your data scientists, your data engineers, but you also have your software developers, you have architects, you have business owners, SMEs, even legal and compliance. It's how are you able to start to bring all of those individuals together in a very consistent and a repeatable way to start to drive some of these meaningful outcomes that can be leveraged within personalization framework. And that's what our product Cortex is really aimed to do. Think of us as this intelligence layer that's going to sit between your system of record and system of engagement. On the left-hand side of this bookend, you have your existing data science workbenches, you have your existing data engineer and data pipelines. No, we're not here to displace that. And in fact, what we're here to do is augment that and sit on top of it to help maximize the existing investments and preferences that organizations have already been put in. Similar story can be said on the right-hand side of this bookend, which is really your system of engagement. You already have out there tools and technologies that are driving your digital channels, your web portals, your mobile apps, your CRM systems, right? What we want to be able to do is help bring together, all of the different data assets, all the different models, and be able to start to drive this personalized intelligence into your existing, end user experiences. And we have in this framework, a platform that really is enabling you to connect into any type of machine learning model or non-machine learning model. So this could also include things like rules engines, deterministic algorithms, business logic, even RPAs, to be able to package that up in what we call as a Cortex skill. Think of that as an integration point or an interface around your existing models and engines. And what we're able to do is we start to publish these different insights or data elements into what's called a profile. And this is really being able to start to build out a rich knowledge representation of an entity, whether that entity is a person, place, or thing. So in healthcare, we build profiles of members, but we also build profiles of claims. We build profiles of providers. In banking, we'll build profiles of products. In real estate, we build profiles of houses. And what you're able to do then is start to draw out a longitudinal record or an understanding of really that entity and how you want to be able to apply the appropriate level of engagement that we think is the best way of servicing that individual within your existing engagement. We have APIs that are plugged back into the profile, which then allow you to learn, which ultimately that can help become your feedback store, which is leveraging your model development to retrain those algorithms. But also we use that feedback as a mechanism to start to monitor or measure KPIs that are meaningful to your line of business. And then underneath all of this is a governance layer, because the way that we view personalization, the trust comes from not just how often are you able to get the answer right to that individual, but to make sure that any of these insights or decisions that are being made are being done in a trusted and transparent way. Now, to boil that down, kind of like double click, this profile, this nebulous entity, what is this really able to do? Well, the company of CognitiveScale has been around for about 9 years now. And while we started in the healthcare and financial services space, we also did a lot of work in retail, digital commerce. And a lot of the things that we had as requirements coming into our product came from retail, where it was asking us questions like, well, how would you track an anonymous person on our website? How would you generate an insight in real time? How would you provide this more of an omni-channel experience, where if I had somebody working on the web portal, but then they switch over to the mobile app and then they call up the call center, can you keep all that context? And so we brought in a lot of these different requirements and capabilities into this product that's called Profile of One, and we distilled it down into 5 key functional areas. The first is just let's build a profile. That can come from a series of connectors that we have as part of the platform, which is connecting into your existing data pipelines, being able to package your existing models, and we can do this by presenting new leads into different types of organizations. The second thing that we do is then we're able to start to select, what is the right outreach that we think is appropriate for this individual. The third is that we then learn, are these messages resonating? We also can measure the effectiveness of this as it relates to, key KPIs, and then we apply assurance to this. Now, conceptually, the way that we think about this is how are we really influencing kind of an end-to-end user journey? And we like to call this kind of like a Waze-like experience. So similar to if you think about like your favorite GPS tool, Apple Maps, Google Maps, Waze, right? What that's doing is it's going to guide you in real time to get you from point A to point B. And as events are taking place, it's going to trigger some type of outreach and alert you to maybe switch directions or follow a different path. Well, the same analogy can be applied to an individual as it relates to your healthcare member experience or your banking customer experience. You want to be able to publish these events onto this profile through some streaming mechanism. And as events are being published, you want to have that feed into other models that are listening in that can generate new insights. And that can then help with understanding the new types of engagements. And if it's a trajectory that we're observing around an individual that we want to avoid, like it could be, we think that this person is about to call into the call center, what you can then do is you can trigger, some engagement strategy that we call an intervention, which is then being able to start to surface a message to that individual in a meaningful way and get them back on track of where we're heading, right? A key thing that we have with all of this is really being able to run through simulations. So, rather than deploying this out in the wild and testing these types of messages in a pilot or A/B type of way, what we want to be able to do is run simulations prior to that deployment to be able to see how optimal that this engagement strategy would be. It's very similar to we were just talking over here about F1. So in Austin, there's an F1 race coming up in 2 weeks in Coda. You would never expect that person or that team of people to build an F1 vehicle, assemble some parts, make modifications, and then just throw it on the track and hope for the best, right? But that's kind of what's been done, in the industries around how AI is being run. You're cobbling together a bunch of models or some other types of rules, and then you're kind of hoping that, the very first time that you send it out, you're going to reach the KPI or business value that you're expecting. And then if you're not, you're going to collect that feedback, and then eventually, over the course of several months, you're going to get there. But businesses aren't that patient. And so what we want to be able to do is shrink that time down as much as possible and be able to start run kind of these test beds within a way of simulating the effectiveness to get you to that KPI as fast as possible. And then the last thing, right, is whenever we are making decisions when it comes to personalization, it's important that we do understand that these decisions are trusted. And so when we think about trust, we think about being able to apply several different factors around an insight or a decision that's being produced. And what you're seeing here is 6 factors that we bring into the product as we look at trust. And what's interesting as this pie graph is being represented, on the right-hand side, these are metrics that are more geared towards data scientists, right? So if you have a model, you should be able to start to calculate things like how explainable is this model, how robust is it, is there any potential bias, right? On the left-hand side, you want to look at other metrics of trust that aren't necessarily the responsibility of the data scientists, but other groups, like the effectiveness of the model is going to be more around like the business owner. Data risk could be coming from your chief risk officer. Compliance is your legal team. It could be auditors. It's interesting that when we talk to data scientists about this, they do not want to deal with regulations. Like nobody wants to go through and understand what's happening with CCPA or GDPR as it relates to the models that are being built. But that's what your legal team is asking you. And so there's this friction, right, that takes place between the output of what your data science teams are producing and what your legal and compliance teams are expecting and what your auditors are actually tracking. And so what we want to be able to do is provide this level of trust and transparency across all these different groups to ensure that that level of collaboration and transparency is done so these models can go into production as fast as possible. Technically, the way that we think about this is you have all of your models that are being developed, that is your IP. That's not something that necessarily should be opened up. And so we treat every model as a black box. All we need is really just a input data set and an API that we can run the predictions against. And the way that we go through levels of explainability is we use a genetic algorithm that's able to start to produce counterfactual explanations. And what that ultimately is going to do is it's going to start to assess which features within this vector set would I have to change to come back with a different outcome. So if I have a model where I only have to change one feature, then that model becomes 100% explainable. The more features that I have to change, the less explainable that model becomes. And what you can do with this counterfactual explanation is actually start to produce additional scores as it relates to things like fairness and bias. Is there any potential discrimination that could be happening against some demographic group based off of gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera, right? So that's kind of at a high level, the behind the scenes, at least, how we look at trust and how we apply that across any of the models. And so any model that's being published and registered and applied to these profiles, they're being scanned with these metrics as a way of being able to track over time, is there any potential drift? So at a broad level, the framework that we follow, it starts actually with not the data or the models. It starts with the business goal, which is it's a little unique in thinking about this. So when we work with different business units, it's always what is that KPI that you're looking to drive? Are you looking to improve conversion by a certain target? Are you looking at improving the funnel of leads coming in for your marketing team? Are you looking to deflect calls, et cetera, for your call center? And then from there, what we then are able to do is apply some of our industry standards around these profiles, and we're able to start to plug into your existing data sets, be able to hook into the existing models that have been developed, and we start to publish that onto their profiles, right? You can then segment these profiles into what it is that you're looking to target. We call these cohorts. And then what you're able to provide then is a series of interactions we call interventions, which is what are the different ways that we want to be able to outreach to these people. Whether it's sending them an email when some event takes place, to a push notification on their mobile app, or having them interact with a chatbot. These are all different things that actually get plugged into your system of engagement, which is actually then going to go off and send those interventions. And before you would ever go and actually send some personalized banner over your Adobe experience or your Pega CRM system, what you have is the ability to simulate, refine the effectiveness of how well we think that this is working, go through the workflow, deploy it, then they'll start to send off all these interventions. And then what you have is the way of being able to start to monitor and measure this, which we again have a way of being able to calculate things like bias, fairness, robustness, explainability, or you can also plug into companies like weights and biases as you're looking at things like performance of a model over time. Right? So that's at a high level kind of the framework that our product fits in. But I think based off of that, let's actually show you some of this so you can see visually how all this kind of comes together. Okay, so just to kind of introduce the use case before I just kind of jump into it. So I'm gonna walk you through a specific example within the healthcare industry. This is going to be a call center example. So here what we're going to do is we're going to look at ways of how we're able to start to apply personalization efforts to do things like improving your call deflection rate, right? So it's actually a pretty substantial problem with large enterprises that have millions of individuals that they service. They can have up to 100 million, actually, well, depending on some companies, they have 200 million calls coming in easily per year. So if you can just deflect, a very small percentage of that, that's a crazy amount of savings, right? So the first thing that we can think through about this particular use case is, how are we going to be able to start to build out this profile to be able to start to provide some level of personalization. And what you're seeing, by the way, on the screen before I move off of it, this is called our Cortex Council. So this is, what different roles are going to be using to start to construct that workflow that I just showed you on the previous slide. And it is role-based, so you have specific capabilities for data engineers, for data scientists, for software developers, for domain experts, et cetera. But what we have is a way of being able to start to hook into a wide variety of different data sources. We support over 260 different connectors that give you flexibility into first-party data, third-party data, structured, unstructured, social media, business applications like Salesforce, for a call center. That's pretty common. And what we do with those connectors is then we start to construct data sources and then transform that data into profiles. Just given the time that we have in the demonstration, what I thought would be more effective is just to kind of show you what an end result of a profile actually looks like. Now, this profile is, again, it's a longitudinal view of an entity. And so what I mean by that is, you're able to start to keep track of all the different elements of this entity and how that entity is evolving over time. And within this visualization, you can key into what are some of the specific attributes that make up, in this case, a member's profile of one. The way that we think about a profile is really broken into, three distinct elements. The first is what we call as declarative information. So this is leveraging the connectors into your system of record where we're able to start to bring in some data that's been explicitly found, like general information like their demographics. The second type of data, though, that we bring on top of these profiles is called observations or observed behavior. So this is streaming data that's coming in. This is clickstream data, mobile app utilization, call center inquiries, where you're able to start to very easily, through an expression editor, create what are these calculated attributes, where you can provide analytics or trends of the data that's coming in and start to do things like, roughly how active is a person by time of the day versus day of the week. And then the third type of element that we bring on top of these profiles are the models themselves. So this is, again, any model that's being developed in your existing workbenches, regardless if that's a Jupyter Notebook, SageMaker, H2O AI, et cetera. We have SDKs, CLIs, APIs that enable you to start to publish these models or the outputs of those models as inferences on top of these profiles. So now what you're seeing is, for this particular individual, what's the likelihood that they would end up, picking up the phone and calling into the call center? So it's a combination of kind of those declared, observed, and inferred attributes that make up this temporal profile of one. And as I mentioned earlier, right, we're not just building profiles of people, right? We build profiles of any entity, and hopefully I didn't lose my connectivity when I showed this earlier, but I'll try since the meetup anyways. But so for an example, what I mean by that is, for this particular individual member, what you'll see is that we have, a list of claims. They're historical claims, right, that are tied to it. If I click on one of those claims, what that takes me to is a new profile. So this is a profile of a claim. And what we're able to do then is start to draw out a network of how these entities relate to one another that's going to give us then a foundation that's driving personalized, efforts within some type of business process. I was in Orlando a couple of weeks ago, and for an amusement park. And the way that we were explaining it to them was, look, we'll build your profiles of customers, visitors that are coming into your theme park today, but we'll also build profiles of rides, your amusement. I mean, if we know that today a ride is only maximized at 50% of their efficiency, like they're only going to take 50% of the people coming in, that's context into, how you'd want to be able to recommend, should we show this person to go to this ride or not? So it's those types of things that we look at as being able to bring together the profiles and the context around those profiles to drive, these types of initiatives. Now, the profiles themselves, as I mentioned, everything is enabled through an API. It's actually optimized, to hook into this profile API within your, end system. So you can call this directly through, into your mobile apps or into your web portals or your CRMs. We also have direct connectivity into Kafka if you want to just, stream it that way, or if you want to use some, JDBC connector and run this as like a bulk batch or as a Spark. That's all enabled, within the platform itself. Okay, so what do we do with those profiles though once we've started to build them? I'll just kind of show, I guess, this last piece. I guess we have, what time do we end? Do we end at 7 or? Okay, I'll show this last piece, and then if there's any other questions, we can talk into some other stuff. Which is, how we're able to provide the right engagement to an individual with this profile data, right? And this gets into really that level of understand the trajectory of an individual and how would you start to simulate what the right engagement strategy is prior to deploying. So again, service experience, we're looking at ways of deflecting calls within the healthcare space. What you're seeing here is, these 3 different components. The first component is, how do we start to identify a cohort, right? How are we looking at a segment or a population that we want to target today? And behind the scenes, all this is just running a simple filter query on top of the profile data that I just showed you. So like I mentioned earlier, we have an expression editor that you can, write all of these expressions in and very quickly create segments on the fly. And that'll allow us to start to generate these cohorts. The second component here is the goal. What is it that we're looking to achieve? Here we're looking to improve call deflection. Again, if I click on this and open it up behind the scenes, what this has given you is a way, again, of creating a very simple expression off of that data where you can start to define that analytic. You also can start to identify, what is your starting value? Where do you think your call deflection is today? What is your target state? Like, what's the ideal target state that you'd want to get to? How long would you want to be able to start to run this type of engagement strategy? And how frequently do you want to be able to measure this? This ultimately becomes your feedback store that you can then bring in and start to measure and monitor those KPIs. And then finally, the last piece here is our mission, which is how are we going to go out and target the people in these cohorts to achieve this goal? So as I open up this, what you're seeing in this visual experience is actually a way for individuals to start to create these interventions. And as I mentioned, right, an intervention could be something like, I want to proactively email a person whenever their deductible balance changes, or I want to notify them, over their mobile app if they're about to get an expected bill. Even things like, I think some people are likely to call in around this type of, inquiry. Rather than letting them call in, I'm going to send them, a link to some chatbot that's already been configured to answer those types of questions. And each of these interventions is actually linked to an action. So if I was to deploy this, right, it's going to go off and it's going to integrate with, some type of like email server, which is going to go off and start to send these emails. But what you can do is not just, create these interventions in this environment, but you can simulate it, right? So what I'll do is I'll kick off a quick simulation just so you guys can see the visual here and what this is doing. And as this loads, I'll kind of explain what's happening here. So the first thing is that the platform itself, it's a dedicated instance. We're optimized to run on all the major cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, or even on-prem. It's all deployed natively on top of Kubernetes. And what's happening is we're just going to spin up the appropriate compute necessary to run this job, right? Once this loads up, it'll then go through, and it's going to go through a initialization and a training phase, which is given each of these interventions, how are we going to basically train this model, which think of it as just could be a like a recommendation model against this particular goal. We call this our AMP engine, AI Mission Planner engine. What you're kind of helping out with is for a way of reducing the time it's going to take to test out this type of engagement strategy I mentioned, like in the wild. But also what you're doing is you're basically training your own machine learning model, for this particular process. So what's happening here is the training phase is starting. On the right-hand side, it's going to run quickly, so don't take your eyes off the screen. What you'll see here is profiles that are found in the cohort, and it's starting to map up what do we think is the right engagement versus for these different profiles, and that was completed very quickly just because I ran only I think 100 cycles. But basically, what you saw kind of flash on the screen was as a profile was coming in that Space Invaders type visualization. The green flash meant that by sending that type of message to that person, we think that their call would be deflected. Red means that we don't think. Right? They still would end up calling in. And what you're left with is kind of now a view into what the success is for each of these different interventions. So let's say in our cohort of maybe 10,000 people for this one intervention, the simulation thought that about almost 947 would be good candidates based off of how this was configured with preconditions. As the end result, we think that 255 calls would be deflected. And I could look at that and I could say, yeah, that's good enough for what I want. Let's go off and deploy it. Or I can say that doesn't sound right. I think it should be more or it should be less. We have a whole process in here that you can actually go through and refine these plans, which you're basically going through and starting to give your own labeled data. And that then goes in as a way of being able to help retrain these simulations to get them more precise over time. And that workflow, eventually goes into a refinement stage and a deployment stage, which will then, once this gets deployed, it'll then go off and start to execute these messages against your cohort. And then we track, the TTL for each of these messages, and we're ultimately bringing that back into this, KPI store. So business users can then start to see, is this moving the needle in the right direction of what I'm expecting from an application, right? And I think that's unique in the way that we think about this because, again, different groups are focused on different metrics. Oftentimes when we're working with data scientists, they have a model and they say, well, it's 95% accurate, or some measure of their preciseness. And that doesn't cross over to what the business is expecting, right? What they want to know is, well, how many calls are being deflected? And so this is a way of how you're able to start to help bridge some of that friction or bridge that gap across these different groups. So as data scientists, you're focused on what you're doing best, which is develop, author new models. And as the business is looking at this and evaluating the KPIs, then that's giving you more flexibility and freedom into retraining those models, adding new features to it, and make it more effective. So this is kind of the end-to-end life cycle as it's being built within this platform, Cortex. So that was kind of everything I had. I mean, there's a lot of other things I could walk you through in the demonstration, but I think that was kind of everything I had for this particular talk. So probably end there and see if anyone has any questions.